What I want you to understand and what I want you to think is, whenever you hear in the media the term fiscal black hole, I want you to hear fiscal enormous pile of money, because it is not possible for debt to grow without private wealth growing. And whenever anybody tells you, how do we pay the debt back? I want you to turn around and say to them, where has the money gone? Who has the money now? Why don't we tax them? Okay, I'm back. Today, we're going to talk about debt and the fiscal black hole. Okay, so just as we predicted in the very first video on this channel, how the rich get richer from COVID-19, government debt has increased massively in the last 3 years. Also, as we predicted at the beginning of this channel, that is now being used by the Conservative government to justify a round of austerity cuts. This is going to mean less money for public services, hospitals, education, police, local services. These are all things which have already been massively cut in the David Cameron, George Osborne government, 2010 to 2016. In many cases, these services are already cut to the bone. Cutting them further is going to decimate services. It's going to mean less money in your pocket if you work in the public sector. There's really a risk it's going to really threaten the fabric of our country, our basic services. And throughout all of that, it is going to be justified by the idea that there is an enormous government debt and enormous fiscal black hole. So it's very important that you understand debt. We're going to explain that today. Okay, so government debt. The government debt has increased since COVID from 1.9 trillion to 2.5 trillion. Now, I think these really big numbers like trillions, they're very, very difficult to understand. So I think the easiest way to understand the size of the government debt is to look at it on a per person or a per adult basis. So the current government debt has increased to about £50,000 for every single adult in the country. Okay, so that's a lot, that's a big number, £50,000. How do we understand debt? Okay, the first thing is that government debt is not the only kind of debt that exists in the country. There's also significant amounts of individual debt. The most obvious is mortgage debt. So lots of people have a mortgage, maybe you have a mortgage. The average amount of mortgage debt held by a UK adult is £35,000. So that's on top of the £50,000 of government debt. And there's also other debts, student debts, consumer debts, which add up to about £5,000 per adult in the country. So for every adult in the country, you've got £50,000 of government debt, £35,000 of mortgage debt, another £5,000 of other debts. So what is the total amount of debt per person in the whole country if you add up everybody's debts? You might think 50 at 35 at 5, that's £90,000 per person. But what if I was to tell you that the total amount of debt in the whole country is exactly zero £0? You might think, okay, that doesn't make sense. There's all these debts. How can they add up to zero? Well, if I wanted to work out how much debt you were in, it wouldn't make sense for me to just look at your mortgage, right? If you have a big amount of money in a savings account, I should take your mortgage and I should also subtract your savings, right? So let's say you've got a £100,000 mortgage, but you've also got £50,000 in savings. Your total debt, it's not £100,000, right? It's 100 minus 50, that's £50,000. Well, whenever you have a debt, it's very important to understand that that debt is to somebody. The money that you owe is money that is owned by somebody that you owe the money to. So what that means is, if we look at everybody's debts and also everybody's credits, money owed to them, it always must add up to zero. It absolutely must, because if you owe money, then you must owe that money to somebody. If you didn't owe that money to anybody, then you wouldn't have to pay it back, right? Nobody would complain. That is the way that debt works. Debt is always money owed by somebody to somebody else. What that means is, all of this debt that exists in the country, £50,000 per adult of government debt, £35,000 of mortgage debt, another £5,000 of other debts, this £90,000 of debt per person must be owned by someone, which means the average amount of money that you control owed to you must be £90,000 per person. I think this is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, because when you think of that massive amount of government debt, 50 grand per person, that massive amount of mortgage debt, £35,000 per person, all the debts, every single debt you have, every single debt everybody you know has, everybody's mortgages is owned by someone, and the total amount of debt must be zero. Because if you owe it, somebody owns it. Your debt is an asset to somebody, your debt is wealth to somebody. Your debt is wealth owned by somebody. So the reason that I point this out is because some of the ways that this debt crisis have been described in the media are totally insane. So we talk about a black hole, a fiscal black hole. So if the government has generated a fiscal black hole, which the implication is the government has generated an enormous debt, it absolutely must be that somebody has generated a fiscal massive fucking pile of cash. It's impossible for it not to go like that. And this is exactly what I said in the first video on this channel. If you haven't watched it, please go and watch it, How the Rich Get Richer from COVID-19. I said that COVID will cause a massive increase in government debt, and exactly mirroring that and offsetting it, a massive increase in private wealth owned by rich people. And if you think about it, it is not possible for those two things to exist without one another. They are the same thing. If there is a massive increase in government debt, then there must be a massive increase in private wealth. In fact, the increase in government debt is the increase in private wealth. And the increase in private wealth is the increase in government debt. The reason that the rich have got richer is because the government owns the money. The reason the government have got poorer is because they owe money to the rich. It's so important to understand this because the media descriptions are insane. It's not a black hole, it's a transfer of wealth from the government to the rich. And if we wanted to fix this crisis, we could easily do it by taking the money back from the rich, it's still sitting in their bank accounts, back to the government. Now, there was an article out a couple of weeks ago where the head of the IFS, the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which looks at government finance in this country, I think his name was Paul Johnson, said we've all got a lot poorer. We've all just got a lot poorer. And I think he was referring to this increase in government debt. And if you sit and think about that, it's an insane statement. Because if the government has gotten poorer by giving a crap ton of money out, then we as a whole haven't got poorer, right? All that's happened is the government has given money to the people of the country. We as a whole have not gotten poorer. The problem is that all of that money that's been given out, which is £600 billion so far since the beginning of COVID, £12,000 per adult in the country, has been accumulated by richer families and richer households. So really, we as a country have not gotten poorer at all. All that has happened is there has been a massive transfer of cash from the government to the rich. So what I want you to understand and what I want you to think is, whenever you hear in the media the term fiscal black hole, I want you to hear fiscal enormous pile of money. Because it is not possible for debt to grow without private wealth growing. And whenever anybody tells you, how do we pay the debt back? I want you to turn around and say to them, where has the money gone? Who has the money now? Why don't we tax them? Because the reality of the situation here is that £600 billion, which has been lost by the government, is exactly pound for pound offset by £600 billion accumulated by the rich of this country. That is how debt works. You cannot owe debt to nobody. If you have increased your debt by £600 billion, someone has increased their wealth by £600 billion. That is £12,000 per adult. If you do not have your £12,000, somebody has it. And it is, in most people's cases, the rich that have that, because we can see statistically that that money has been accumulated by the rich. If you don't understand why, go and watch the first video on this channel, How the Rich Get Rich from COVID-19, which predicted exactly everything that has happened. That government debt would increase, that private wealth of the rich would increase, that inflation would increase, that asset prices would increase, that house prices would go up, and that we would see a massive crisis of inflation and living standards. This was exactly predictable because during COVID, £600 billion went from the government to the rich. So you need to understand that is not a black hole. That is a pile of money sitting in the bank accounts of the rich. Austerity is not an unavoidable choice. It is something that we are choosing to do because the government, which is currently ruled by a man whose father-in-law is one of the richest men in the entire world, is choosing not to tax the rich, who have just seen the biggest and fastest ever increase in wealth, but instead to raise your taxes, to cut your pay, and to cut your public services. Every single pound in that fiscal black hole is sitting right now in the bank accounts of the rich. If we took that back, there's no need for austerity. If we took that back, we could give every single adult in the country £12,000. Imagine that, £12,000 in your bank account. That is not making the rich poor. That is just making them exactly as rich as they were 3 years ago before COVID. Every single thing that is happening here was predictable at the beginning of COVID if you understood the massive increase in inequality and the massive cash transfer that would go from the government to the rich. If you don't believe me, go and watch my first video, How the Rich Get Richer from COVID-19, because everything that has happened, I have exactly predicted would happen. This austerity is not essential. There is no fiscal black hole. Every single pound needed by the government is held by the rich. And this austerity is a choice by a government led by one of the richest men in the world. We don't need to do this. We don't need austerity. Every time you hear fiscal black hole, think fiscal pile of money. If anybody questions you, send them to this channel, show them this video, make them watch the first video, How the Rich Get Richer from COVID-19. Austerity is a choice. While you are struggling to feed your kids and heat your homes, the rich are getting richer at the fastest rate in history. We could stop this at the drop of the hat if we chose to tax the rich, and we have to do it. Thank you. Like the video, share, subscribe. Thanks.
Money currently is flowing from the government to the rich, leaving the government with big piles of debt and the rich with big piles of money.
There is one other thing they can do with that massive amount of income. They can buy your mum's house.